Patrick, one of the reasons that free will is such an important topic is it speaks directly to moral responsibility and indeed moral judgments that society has to make. Where does the sense of agency come into this picture? People go right from free will to moral responsibility, but agency seems to sit there in a critical place.
Sure, absolutely. Sense of agency is fundamental to the idea of moral responsibility. And just to give you a little example, in UK law, there's actually the so-called McNaughton rules, which suggest that you can only be responsible for your action if you're aware that you are making an action. So if you don't have a sense of agency, the law treats you completely differently from if you do. The law will treat you as criminally insane if you don't have a sense of agency. So the point about sense of agency is it gives us this feeling of controlling events in the outside world. And if we control events in the outside world, then we may be responsible for what those events are. And one of our interesting questions that we've asked is there a difference between how we experience agency over a arbitrary, if you like, cold event, like a beep, and something which is actually significant, something which has meaning? So we've done some simple experiments where we've asked people to make an action, and instead of the action being followed by a beep a quarter of a second later, it's followed by what one might call a moral vignette. All right? So we can't actually ethically do experiments where people do things that are morally significant.
Right.
That would never pass an ethical committee, and it shouldn't pass an ethical committee. But what we can do is we can give people a picture on the computer screen which indicates a moral dilemma. So
What's an example?
Okay, so the very standard example, which we borrowed from the work of Joshua Green, is a situation where there is a train coming down a track and it's at a fork, points in the track, and you have the ability to divert it onto one or other of the two forks of the track. And there are 5 railway workers on one of the forks of the track, and there's 1 railway worker on the other. So it's currently heading down the fork of the track where it's going to run over 5 railway workers and kill them. And you have the capacity to press the button, switch the points, and divert the train onto the other fork of the track where there's 1 railway worker working. So you will intervene in that situation, but you will then be responsible for the death of that railway worker. You'll avoid the deaths of the 5 on the other track, but you'll be, in some real sense, responsible for that 1. So this is a standard moral dilemma because, reassuringly, people find this a really difficult decision to make. People tangle with those questions. And we were able to pick those sorts of scenarios, represent them graphically, and show them as a consequence of the person's action. So we did a very simple experiment where we asked the person to press a button to divert or not divert the train from the track that it was currently running on. And then a quarter of a second later, you saw a picture which showed how many unfortunate railway workers your train had run over as a result of your action in this scenario. And we measured exactly the same temporal shrinkage. In other words, the temporal experience of a close association between what I did and what happened in this moral scenario, as opposed to the simple scenario where you press a button and hear a beep.
A neutral
one. And the interesting finding was that people experience a tighter temporal coupling. They experience more of this temporal shrinkage or temporal binding when their actions have morally significant consequences compared to when they have completely neutral consequences.
Now, this shrinkage is a brain-manufactured shrinkage. It's not there in the real world. In the real world, there is a duration that's constant and immutable.
Exactly.
But we read into it. We create this
association.
Yeah.
And I think
and it's tighter when there's a moral consequence than when it's neutral.
So I think what this means is that when we're in a context where our actions are significant and particularly morally significant, then we have an enhanced sense of agency. So,
and you're defining enhanced sense of agency by a tighter artificial association between the action and the activity.
Yeah, I don't think it's artificial. I think it's real, but it's a tighter association. So I think that tight association is a marker.
It's artificial in the sense the brain is creating it.
Yeah. It's
it's real in the brain.
The actual interval between your button press and the picture on the screen is always controlled by us. And it's constant.
Right.
But people experience that interval as shorter
right.
when the picture on the screen is morally significant compared to when it isn't.
Right.
So it's generated by the brain, and I think what it shows is that when our actions are morally salient, shall we say, or when they have morally significant consequences, we experience a stronger sense of agency than when those actions are perhaps just purely arbitrary, throwaway.
And your parameter of agency and the strength of agency is based on how tightly the action and the activity in the world, the consequence, is tied.
That's exactly right, and that's quite scientifically nice because we're asking people questions about time. We're not asking questions about morality or about agency.
Right.
So our measures are implicit. They're kind of indirect. So we can bypass a lot of the sort of cultural superstructure that you would get if you asked people to make direct moral judgments, and we can ask them about their immediate sensory experiences of their own actions and of the consequences.
Can we infer about the nature of agency because it is stronger in moral situations as opposed to neutral ones?
I think we can infer that you would need a sense of agency. You'd need the ability to associate what you do with what happens in order to have moral responsibility. I think you couldn't have moral responsibility unless you first had a sense of agency.
Okay, that's going in one direction, but can we go the other direction and ask whether the whole creation or development of the sense of agency is somehow related to a need to deal with moral situations?
I think that human culture and human society has to have an idea of responsibility, and it has to have, if you like, a set of moral codes. That all human societies have that. And I think that those moral codes have taken advantage of the fact that we have a sense of agency. We have an ability to associate what we do with what happens.
But the agency gets stronger when you see a moral situation. That means that the agency itself is sensitive to a moral situation.
But I don't think you need to have morality to have agency. So I think the rat in the Skinner box that presses a lever to get food, I think it would experience a sense of agency if it knew how to tell us.
Sure,
about
but we're seeing the strength of it. The strength of it. So what can we distill out of what we call moral that would help reinforce the sense of agency? Because agency is getting stronger in a moral situation. So agency is changing, right?
I think that's because those situations are the ones that are really important. So I think that the way that we live means that many of our actions have particularly strong significance. Why? Well, probably because they're socially significant. So maybe moral and social are more or less synonymous here. So the actions for which I'm morally responsible are the actions which impact on you. And we have I think, a particularly strong attunement to our experiences which involve other people. And I suspect that the reason why our sense of agency is particularly strong in a moral context is because we pay a lot of attention and we have a particularly acute ability to perceive how we interact with others.
So this temporal binding, this shrinkage of duration between the action and the consequence in the environment has a dramatic and direct effect on the sense of agency. Maybe that's how a sense of agency developed, because of the need to have this impact in the environment.
Absolutely. So I think sense of agency is all about identifying and encoding the relations between what I do and the salient or important consequences of my own activity. Because if I can understand the crucial ways that I can change my environment and generate a strong experience of how I'm able to influence the world, what I can make happen, that is clearly important for survival and for the success of the organism. So now let's think about this specific case of an action which has a morally significant consequence, where we find this particularly strong temporal binding. Well, I think that in the social world and for social animals such as us, you can really use moral and social as more or less synonyms. So the really important actions that I make are the ones which have effects on you and effects on other people. So it doesn't seem surprising that we experience a particularly strong sense of agency for those actions that we make which change the way that we relate to other people and change the way that other people relate to us. So I suspect that the sense of moral responsibility depends on a sense of agency, but becomes a particularly important, particularly strong, particularly acute experience of the way that what we do can change the world in which we live.